Hey everybody, it's Mrs. Snook. How are you today? So here's our first lecture in our new unit, which is chapter 5 and 6 together, and this is going to be about the Gilded Age. We're going to be looking at basically what happens in America between 1876 and 1904. It's about 30 years in American history, and it really starts with the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, and the period of time kind of comes to an end when Teddy Roosevelt's elected. Now we're going to talk today about how this period of time is known as the Gilded Age. We're going to talk a little bit about how it has this name associated with it, how it got its name and why. And basically, when you're thinking of the Gilded Age, what was life like? How were the changes related to the Industrial Revolution impacting Americans? And I've got some pictures here for you to kind of get your mind thinking about this. But basically, people will start getting jobs in factories. They'll start riding bicycles as a new type of recreation. The light bulb will be created, the telephone will come out, and many people will be living in cities. So during this time period, we're going to see lots of changes happening in America. And we're going to focus mostly what's happening in the north. We'll talk a little bit what's happening in the south and the west, but for the most part, many people who are tired of trying to be farmers out west or cowboys, they're going to leave that life, move to the big cities, and get jobs in factories here around by 1900. So kind of our learning goals. You don't really need to write down this slide, remote learners. But basically, the learning goals are all about, what is the Gilded Age? How did it get its nickname? What happens during the first Industrial Revolution compared to the second Industrial Revolution? And what is life like for a factory worker? Last chapter, it was all about what was life like for a farmer? What was happening to cowboys? How did they deal with moving out west? What kind of interactions did they have with Native Americans? We talked about the difficult nature of being a cowboy and the low pay and the dangerous, work that they faced. In this chapter, we're really going to be focusing on factory workers, and we'll talk about what the experience was like for a man compared to a woman, compared to an immigrant. We'll talk about, the difficult nature of the job, the dangers, how factory workers are going to try to come together to unionize, to try to get better wages and shorter hours and safer conditions, and how, unfortunately, wealth is going to be divided in America, more so than ever before. There will be this gap between rich people, who will be referred to as robber barons or captains of industry, and ultimately, basically, poor people who work in the factories. And it's really going to all come about because of industrialization. New inventions are great. Sure, they make people's lives easier, but you have to have the money to buy the inventions. And most people didn't. Most people, earned very little amounts of money. Often factory workers worked 12 to 14 hours a day for only $1, and the conditions were not necessarily safe. And really, the factory managers might be doing all right. They were kind of the small middle class, but it's the factory owners who are incredibly wealthy. And we're going to talk this chapter about people like Andrew Carnegie, who's famous for steel, and John D. Rockefeller, who becomes the richest man in the world because of his, interest in the oil industry and becomes an oil tycoon. And these men, they become incredibly wealthy, partially because they're shrewd businessmen who are very smart, but also because they choose not to pay their employees and to treat them terribly. They were really no better, no worse than other people of their time, but they could have made smarter choices. One of the things that you're going to be thinking about this week is, are these men actually good guys? Are people like Andrew Carnegie actually heroes? Did they do their best to treat their employees, to make the conditions safe? Did they pay them a decent wage? Were they just kind of, doing, perhaps it wasn't the kindest, wages, but it was relatable and comparable to other, employers this time? So are they captains of industry? Did they come out with a product to make people's lives better? Did they have charitable contributions to help the world? Were they philanthropists of sorts? Kind of like you hear about Bill Gates today giving away millions of dollars and such to all sorts of foundations and research and schools. Or are these men robber barons? Are they focused on their own wealth? You've probably never heard the term robber baron before, but like a robber is obviously a bad thing, someone who steals. In this case, are they basically, stealing wages from their employees instead of paying their employees more money? They're keeping that money for themselves to get rich, to throw parties, to have big, huge houses, to go on vacations. So are they focused on their own wealth and greed and at the expense of their employees? So we're going to start off really today just talking about what is the Gilded Age and why it gets that name. But then we're also going to talk about, the role of the first industrial revolution and how it is going to eventually lead to the second industrial revolution, which is really what the Gilded Age is all about in America. So the Gilded Age is technically the period of time between 1876 and 1904 where there's all this economic booming, where a lot of inventors start coming out with all sorts of new products during this time period. And they come out with new products, they find basically investors, people who are willing to give them money. The banks give them funds, and they're able to start producing their products. And as people start buying their products, more and more employees will get hired, the factories will expand. And as you are watching that Ed Puzzle this week and learning about immigration, immigrants will be coming to America, they'll be needing jobs, and still getting jobs in these factories. And unfortunately, many of them will not get paid well. In fact, discrimination will be commonplace, and it will be very common for a woman or an immigrant to be paid less than a white man at this point. And really, it's only the inventors, the factory owners that are going to be wealthy, like our man in the figure jumping on all that gold. For the most part, the average person will not be wealthy. Now, you might have heard the term before, Golden Age. Some people think of this time period as, oh, it's a golden age. It's all about inventions and money and business and new products and change. Yes, that's true. But this is the Gilded Age. It's basically the fake golden age. It's not truly a golden age because it's not like everybody is rich and has money and has this easy life. It's a gilded or a fake golden or just gold paint, so to speak, looking age because only a few people, a small percentage of the population is wealthy. Most people are not. And in fact, the gap between the rich and the poor grows wider than ever during this time. Now, as I said, this economic development is really all about the second industrial revolution, which is why we started with that with your KWL chart. And it's this period of time where all these new products are coming out and, people are just changing how they make money more so than ever before. People are turning away from becoming cowboys or farmers. They're not re-upping for the next long drive. Instead, they're going to get factory jobs because even though the pay was not great, it was comparable to a cowboy's pay, and they figured they worked less hours, it was safer, they got more sleep. Now, this Gilded Age starts in 1876 when Rutherford B. Hayes becomes president, and it goes till 1904 when Roosevelt is elected. So it's about 30 years. So what we've done is we've gone from talking about America from 1850 to 1875, basically the Civil War and its aftermath in the South and in the West. Now we shift to the next 30 years in the future. And we're going to be looking at this period of change focused on business and rapid expansion, really focusing on what's happening in the North, but in major cities throughout the U.S. as Americans turn away from farming and turn towards factory life. Now, it started in 1876 when Hayes became president. If you haven't been staying up with your president videos, you want to make sure you're doing that, okay? We'll be watching the video clip about Hayes here in the next few weeks. And Hayes becomes president, and he really, when he comes into office, it signals the end of Reconstruction. He was the one that the South, no one voted for him. People were afraid that if the South was going to secede again because another president got elected they hadn't voted for. So that was that whole compromise of 1877, where the South agreed and they said, okay, we're going to accept this man as our president, but we want something in return. And what that was Reconstruction ended. All of the military leaves the South. And unfortunately, that means that the KKK comes to power, the Redeemers, the white politicians who are racist, come to power, and African Americans are afraid to vote or run for office, and Jim Crow laws really go into place. And so as Reconstruction comes to an end, we enter this new period of business focus in America. And it's going to last till when Teddy Roosevelt takes office in 1904, and then he starts kind of a new era focused on change and progress and improving all areas of America. improving actually a lot of the problems created during the Gilded Age. So you might be thinking, how did it get this name? It gets this name because of this very famous book written by Mark Twain. He's the guy who writes The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. He's an amazing writer. Him and his buddy Charles Dudley Warner write this book in 1873 about an immigrant who comes to America. And the immigrant thought that they were going to get off the boat and find a job and get paid super well, and the streets would be paid out of gold, and the houses would be made out of gold, and he'd be living the high life with all these rights and freedoms, and things would be amazing. But that's not what happens. What actually happens is he realizes it's hard to get a job. There's many jobs available, but you don't necessarily want them. They're not willing to pay him very much because he's an immigrant. They make comments about him, about how he smells different and eats different foods and looks different and talks different. There's a huge what we call nativist response, or basically racism. He even gets a smaller apartment in the tenement apartment building. And it's not so easy to get rich. So perhaps the houses are just made out of gold paint, but they're not actually made out of gold. And what basically Mark Twain is saying here is that, life was not so easy in America as many people thought it was going to be. And so it's not truly a golden age of arts or science or even of economic growth. It was just a time period where some people got super rich and the rest of Americans didn't. They really struggled to survive, as I said, with the working conditions and with the long hours and with the low pay. And the gap between rich and poor becomes larger than ever because some people, it's like winning the lottery if they invent something and people love it and start buying it. But for other people, they work long hours and barely see their family, and it's a difficult, dangerous job. And that's kind of what he writes about in this book. And even though it comes out even before the Gilded Age has technically started, what he was saying was very true. New inventions were being created. The Transcontinental Railroad was built. Americans were traveling across the country. More immigrants were coming in than ever before. And, over time, the book just seems more and more true, especially by the time we get to the 1890s, when we see this huge wave of new immigrants coming to America, trying to get away from political problems in Europe and looking for more jobs in America. And so the book just seems more true over time, not less. And historians really picked up on that. And so it gets this name of this fake golden age, about this period of change related to the Second Industrial Revolution. Now, before we get to the Second Industrial Revolution, we need to talk about the First Industrial Revolution. Now remember, revolution just means change. And so we're talking about a change in how Americans do business or how they make money. And the Second Industrial Revolution starts because of the first one. And the First Industrial Revolution did not begin in America. The Second Industrial Revolution did not begin in America. The first one began back in the mid-1700s, going back to the 1720s, 1730s in Great Britain. So we're talking all the way about, at this point, America is still a colony, okay? And Great Britain was pretty politically stable in the 1730s. You have to remember that, the United States does not gain its freedom until 1776 is when we're going to declare our independence. And so it was politically stable. There were no real revolutions or fights. There were also a lot of investors, people with money in England in the 1730s, who were willing to take a risk on entrepreneurs, people who had ideas, who wanted to come out with new products and open up factories and try to make money. The third reason why the Industrial Revolution really began in Great Britain had to do with the fact that Britain had a lot of natural resources like coal and iron. And James Watt will create the first steam engine, where you take coal and you burn it and it produces steam. And that steam engine would go on to be, put into the first steamboat, and it will go into the first steam locomotive. Great Britain will make the first train at this point, and the steam locomotive will go a whopping 26 miles an hour as people ride on it from Manchester, England to London. And some people would think it was, so fast and so scary. I mean, there were people who protested against this change, fearing that their society would be too focused on technology. Some saying that, it's going to cost them jobs, which it did. If you were someone who drove people around, in a horse and buggy, trains would put you out of a job. But other people loved industrialization and the new jobs it created. And so what we see happening is that some people start to leave their farms and they don't want to work on their family farm and they say, I'm going to go move to the big city. I'm going to go get a job in a factory where they're starting to produce all sorts of new goods. And it's going to open up new adventures for me. And it did. And before you know it, cities were growing. Great Britain has always made a lot of money in the textile industry because they got cotton first from the American colonies, from the South. Then they got cotton from England. And so Britain has always, basically created a lot of clothes and made money through textiles. Well, they're going to start coming out with new inventions like basically the spinning wheel, the spinning jenny. They're going to come out with a loom that is water powered. And so some of these first factories will have to be near the river. But once James Watt comes out with the steam engine, they're going to be able to use, the steam engine to power some of these new inventions. But these inventions will really change, the textile industry. They'll be able to produce clothes faster. And since it takes less time, they can charge less money. And eventually, as they're selling more and more, they'll make more money. And so cities start to grow and factories are growing. And some people are getting very rich, but most people are not. They're not making very much money at their factory job. In fact, the conditions are unsafe. And if the machine basically gets stuck, their boss will tell them to stick their hand in there and unstick it. And if they lose a finger, so be it. Some employers were nice and offered basically, to pay the medical bills and to pay your days off from being injured, but other bosses did not. There was no guaranteed medical care or days off or anything like that, or any kind of organized, job or safety standards. So you were pretty much on your own as an employee. But the first revolution, industrial revolution, as it takes hold in Britain, it will spread to Europe, it'll spread to the United States. Those same products will be coming over here as we kind of steal their patents and their ideas. And before you know it, America's changing. There's different social classes. There's a gap between rich and poor. There's people living in big cities. Young women will start to work more to kind of help support their family. The poorest of families will have to make their children work as well to try to make ends meet. And as I said, some employers are kind and some are not. And so what we're going to look at in the next lecture that I give on, I'll probably make it tomorrow and post it here for Wednesday, is just talking more about the second industrial revolution, the next phase of industrialization, some of the inventions that come out with it, who these famous robber barons versus captains of industry are, and kind of how the two industrial revolutions compare. All right, guys, that's it for now. Have a great day. Later.